Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and start. Welcome to the North Central Region Aging Network monthly webinar for professional development. And today I'm happy to have Steve Yoder with us, and we'll give you a brief introduction to Steve. Steve Yoder is a regional educator in community development for Purdue University, joining the staff in 2012. His responsibilities include the design, refinement, and delivery of high-quality educational programs that address local and regional needs throughout Indiana. His work focuses on the themes of quality places and community and organizational development, drawing on over 16 years of experience as an administrator and educator within the field of environmental and scientific nonprofits. Steve holds a BS in social ecology from the University of California, Irvine, and an MS in rural geography from Northern Arizona University. So thank you so much, Steve, for joining us today for our North Central region, and looking forward to your presentation on creating effective agendas for meetings. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Barb. And I see on the line we've got Hannah and Megan and Marilyn, and I'm not sure who the person is, the fourth person there that starts with I.
Oh, it's actually Lori.
Lori, okay.
Okay.
I just want to write down the names here. Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Barb, for the introduction, and welcome. And I really want to get started right off the bat with this webinar by asking all of you guys this simple question right here. What makes meetings effective? We've all been to meetings. We all probably have our opinions about what makes meetings effective or not. So I'd like you to spend just a couple of moments thinking about the answer to that question. What makes meetings effective? You know, think about organizations that you meet with, whether it's associated with your extension work professionally or maybe personally. So, and I'm talking about larger group meetings, not just necessarily one-on-one, but when you're working with a group of people. So your extension related groups, maybe on the personal side, it would be like the PTA or church or scouts. Think about those meetings that have gone well and those that perhaps have frustrated you. What makes them effective? So go ahead, and if you can, I see somebody Marilyn's starting to type down. I'll give you guys a few moments to chat, to write in the chat box what you think about that answer to that question.
Steve, I'm not seeing your PowerPoint. If you wanted to show that today.
I did, and it was up and running earlier. Okay, let's see.
I think you just have to put, hit the share.
Yes, it looks like it might have gone away. Sorry, guys. Let's see here. Let's see. Try that.
Okay, got it.
Is that on there?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Barb. I had it up earlier, but I must have clicked something. So when I did that, then I lost my screen for looking at the chat box. So let me pull that up again. Okay, thank you. So it's got a couple of good things here. Having a clear solution or outcome was one answer to that question. Staying on task was another one, and staying focused on the topic of discussion, coming to a decision so the group can move forward. Nice, thank you for sharing those. Yeah, I have asked this question dozens of times to hundreds of people throughout the state of Indiana over the past few years. And the answers that I get are really similar to what you guys are talking about here, where you're really looking at focused on a particular outcome or solution and staying on that topic, staying on task, and letting the group move forward. I wanted to share with you, because I wasn't sure how many folks we'd have on the webinar this morning. I want to share with you some other examples of answers that groups have given me when I've asked that same exact question here. So I've got other things like the meeting starts and ends on time, pretty basic thing. It follows the agenda, kind of going along with the staying on task part. There's effective leadership. One person doesn't dominate. Diverse perspectives are heard. There is no parking lot meeting afterwards. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been in that situation where you have the meeting after the meeting. Those are some answers that other folks have given. There's clear follow through after the meeting. Things get accomplished, which is sort of like there is a clear solution or an outcome that Marilyn was stating there. And efficient use of participants' time comes up quite a bit too. So I get these answers similar to what you guys have shared, no matter where in Indiana that I go, whether it's a big city or a small town. And I want to talk about how you can help ensure that the things that you're talking about, the things I hear other people saying, actually happen. Making sure you have a clear solution or outcome, staying on task, staying focused. And those things don't just happen on their own. Okay, those answers to that question require some key factors to help ensure that they happen. And so for this webinar, I'm going to focus on 3 of those things to consider when you lead an effective meeting. Two of these factors need to take place before the meeting, which is the agenda and also distributing pre-meeting materials. The third factor happens during the meeting, and that's making sure that the roles of the leader and the roles of the group are well understood and the responsibilities of those groups are understood. And as Barb said earlier when she introduced me, this whole webinar really revolves around the agenda. So let's go ahead and start out with talking about the agenda. A well-designed agenda can really make or break a meeting. It ensures that several of those components that we've been talking about take place. Of course, from a basic level, it should provide a time frame for the meeting, but it can also help create accountability and to help clarify those objectives, those actions, those goals that you guys talked about. So here's an example of an agenda that addresses what we're talking about. And I'm actually going to spend the bulk of this webinar going through this sample agenda with a fine-tooth comb. We're going to go through each column and each line, line by line, column by column, just to get a feel for how this can address these issues. And this is just a sample meeting from a fictional public library board meeting that I designed for this. So going through column, the first column indicates, of course, how long each line item on the agenda will take place. This is really basic. This is just an estimate, and that estimate should really come from a conversation that the presenter for that line item has with the meeting's leader in advance of the meeting. So they both need to be on the same page as far as how long that topic is going to take. That's pretty basic stuff. The second column is where you assign accountability. This is where you assign who the presenter will be, who's in charge of making sure that that line item is discussed and takes place. And again, this individual meets or needs to speak with the meeting leader prior to the meeting so that it's clear about what is going to be discussed. But what I really want to focus on and where the bulk of this webinar is going to talk about is this third column right here. This indicates the objective associated with each of the line items in the agenda. So let's dissect this a little bit. Because objectives fall into basically one of 2 different categories: tangible and intangible objectives. And in order to lead more effective meetings, it really helps to understand the difference between these 2 types of objectives. So look at this. Let's look at this a little bit further. Tangible objectives result in a decision that's going to be made by a group. So that kind of goes along with what Marilyn was saying, where you're having a clear solution or outcome. You're working on a decision made by the group, a clear outcome. On the other hand, intangible objectives don't result in really a decision. Instead, intangible outcomes focus on sharing information. And since tangible objectives result in a decision, they often start with words that you see in the blue box there, like decide or plan or approve. Those are tangible outcomes. Since intangible objectives usually result in information being shared, they often start with words like update or discuss or review. So really, when you think about it, when you have a meeting with people, you're doing one of two things. You're either making decisions or you're sharing information. And meetings are usually considered more effective when the agenda focuses more on the tangible versus the intangible objectives. So you really try to load your agendas with more tangible objectives. If an intangible objective that your group wants to talk about, if that objective can be reached outside of the meeting format, if there's a more effective way to share that information, maybe through an email or a newsletter or some other form of communication, then really it's wise to consider another form of communication than using a meeting to share information, because you want to be efficient with people's time. And so try to avoid having a lot of intangible objectives on your agendas. So here's a little bit more what I'm talking about. Here in this third column, I've highlighted those objectives that are tangible. So again, they tend to start with words like approve or list or decide or prioritize. Again, people tend to feel that meetings that have a lot of tangible objectives just get more things done. And so for this example, I've tried to make sure that our objectives have a lot of tangible objectives. On the other hand, I did include one intangible objective on this agenda. And again, those usually begin with words like update or share. So in this case, it's an update on a summer outreach program where you're sharing information with a group. Again, people tend to feel that meetings with a lot of intangible objectives don't necessarily get a lot done. So I've tried to limit that a number of intangibles on this objective. Curious, anybody have any thoughts or questions about meetings that have a lot of tangible versus intangible objectives? When you go to meetings, do you generally find that you're dealing with a lot of tangibles or intangibles? Any thoughts on that? Okay, Megan asks a good question. How would you recommend helping move a culture of intangible meetings to more tangible ones? And then Marilyn's saying, I'd say more intangibles. And then again, Megan's saying, I feel like half my meetings are full of intangibles. Yeah, I'm not surprised you guys are saying this. This is generally, you're right. There's generally a culture of having meetings have a lot of just information sharing when you could be sharing that outside of the meeting format using emails or newsletters to get the word out, and then devoting the time spent in meetings to actually get stuff done with those tangibles. So how do you recommend moving that? I'd like to put that out to the group. Does anybody have any thoughts about how you would get a group to really start thinking about going towards the tangibles? Any thoughts about that? How do you change that culture? Okay, Marilyn's saying model the behavior in your meetings. rip the Band-Aid off. Yeah, right? So you can, and you can start, I mean, one suggestion is through the agenda process, really start inserting more of the tangible objectives into your agendas in advance of the meeting so that people get to see that you're going to work on these action verbs. And we're going to get to that action column in just a minute here. And actually, let's go there right now, because that's one way I think to help get the group thinking more about moving towards the tangible objectives. So this third column is basically a quick description of the action that will take place by the group. This could be a really easy way for the meeting participants to see whether a particular agenda item is simply informational, like we've been talking about, or actually a decision that needs to take place, a tangible. And that way, when participants scan that column, they can see, okay, when it's time for me to get ready for this meeting, I realize that there's going to be 2 decisions that are going to be made at this meeting, and I have to be prepared to make them. We're also going to be doing some brainstorming, and I also see that there's some information being shared. But the more you can start putting those tangibles on your objectives list or either your action list, I think that's one way, as Marilyn says, you can start to model that behavior and really help move the group towards a culture of those tangibles. Very good question about that. And it's a tough one for groups to go through. I want to go through a couple more things in the time that we have about just this agenda. Notice how many minutes I have devoted to the second line item on this sample agenda. It's 1 minute long, okay? It's 7:05 to 7:06. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. This is because this line item is an example of what's called a consent agenda line item. This is sort of like the new up and coming way to hold meetings, to make them more efficient. A consent agenda line item is a set of approvals that are usually very routine that you lump together as one block. Okay, they usually are routine things that you do not need to discuss a lot of, things like your minutes, reports, perhaps in this example, you have an annual contract that you have to renew every year and there's usually no discussion about it. Anything like that, it's really routine, you can lump together as a block. And if for some reason, if somebody in the group at the beginning of the meeting would like to pull one of those line items out for further discussion, say somebody for the first time in 5 years, say somebody says, hey, I want to look at that leasing contract, they can always pull one of those bullet points out of the consent agenda and make it its own separate line item. Just really curious from the group here, has anyone ever used a consent agenda in their meetings or been to meetings where that was done? I'm really curious if you guys have used this before. Okay, it does not seem like anybody has used this. I'll tell you guys a couple things about this. Again, it's part of changing the culture of a meeting where you can start to go this direction, have a conversation with whoever is leading the meeting to see if they want to do this. I will tell you that when I give this presentation to the leadership program, the community leadership program throughout the state of Indiana, there's usually several people in the room who say they have done this with their organization, and every single time that I've asked this question, those people that use this say they will never go back to the old way of holding a meeting. They will never go back to not using the consent agenda. It really helps to speed up the process of the meeting. So just want to share that with you guys. It's kind of a thing that a lot of organizations are adopting. Because again, one of the things that comes up a lot in meetings, I hear over and over again, is people feel like their time is being wasted. This is one way to avoid that. A couple other things. Another thought about the way you design your agenda is to schedule Any items that require a lot of creativity, like brainstorming, which is the example I've highlighted here, schedule them early on in the meeting. That way your participants will have more energy to vote to creative activities. So you'll see the brainstorm, it takes place just 7 minutes into the meeting, really at the beginning of the meeting. So the way you actually order your agenda items can be helpful, taking advantage of people's fresh creativity. One final thought about the order. If you have a controversial topic on your agenda, you should consider putting it somewhere near the middle of the meeting. And that way you don't have to start the meeting on a hot topic and end the meeting on a hot topic. Here, for example, term limits, which is always a hot topic for groups, is scheduled right in the middle of the meeting. So anyway, that's an example of that being used. Any questions about designing agendas before we move on to the last part? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed something here. Megan was saying I have attended a meeting where that was done in the county council, and then Marilyn said, okay, something similar, but didn't know that it had a name. I'm curious, could you guys share, Marilyn and Megan, how you felt those worked? Was there any issue with that type of a line item, which just took a minute or so? Any thoughts about that? Okay, Megan said she was confused the first time it happened. Yeah, it's kind of part of changing that culture. Okay, Megan was saying it was, but it was made sense to her. Okay, helps create ownership for all. Yeah, people love the consent agenda item, so you'll probably be seeing it happening more and more. And of course, you can, with your groups that you work with, consider taking this up as well. And it does help people to keep engaged. Speaking of getting them engaged, next part, and then we're going to start wrapping it up, is in order for the consent agenda to work, obviously people need to have the information sent in advance, right? You can't spend 1 minute on approving 4 bullet points if they haven't received that information in advance. So in order for that to work, you need to work on the second part of what we were talking about as far as preparing for meetings, which is putting together a meeting packet. So before a meeting, really helpful to make sure that all participants receive a packet of the materials that they need in advance of the meeting that allows them to be prepared to make decisions during the meeting. So it's things like the agenda, like the minutes, like committee and staff reports, really all the stuff that was in the consent agenda. It's sent up front in advance. No time is wasted during the meeting reading the minutes, reading staff reports. As much as you can, get it done down on paper or on PDF or email. Send it out to the group. And it's best if you can give them enough time to read the information in the packet and that was actually my next question. So Megan's asking, could it possibly cause some lack of knowledge if people don't take the time to read it? So that was actually my next question for you guys. This is part of changing the culture of meetings. I was with an organization, you're welcome, yeah. I was with an organization that did not send out a lot of pre-meeting materials. We did a lot of this stuff right at the meeting. We wasted a lot of people's time. And we just had to come to the agreement that we were going to start sending this information out in advance. And we felt as a group that it was not too much to ask people on the board to spend time in advance of the meeting to read this stuff. And there was a little bit of pushback, but the culture eventually changed where people knew that they were expected to read this material in advance of the meeting. Anybody have any thoughts about it? Anybody in the room go to meetings where pre-meeting materials are sent out like this in advance? And do you have any thoughts about that? Okay, well, if it's not something that you're involved with a group that's doing this, okay. Well, so you were told they would not read things beforehand. Well, I will say this then, that it is considered in the world of nonprofit management and board management, is considered standard best practice to do this, and it is not considered to be too much to ask for board members to do this. So that can be a tough thing to maybe get to change the culture, but it is considered standard operating procedure now for most group meetings. So I, I, I don't know if I have the best answer for that when people say they are not going to read things beforehand. But again, you end up wasting people's time during the meeting doing that. So I don't really have a good answer for that. I'd love it if I had some good answers. So if anybody has a good answer, they want to email me, that'd be great. Okay, moving on, I want to just wrap things up. Once you have the agendas out, once you have the meeting materials hopefully out to your group, two things. What do you do as a leader and what do you do as a participant? So obviously the leader before the meeting needs to consult with the key chairs and the staff in terms of putting together the agenda. But during the meeting, they need to just really keep that focus on the agenda. Again, you go back that time and time again. Their job is to also keep it moving along. Sometimes conversations will get bogged down, and it is the job of the leader to know when it is time to move a discussion that's bogging down, move it either to a committee level discussion, say, okay, you guys take this back to a committee, or you two discuss it between our next meetings so that we're not wasting everybody's time. And they also need to know when it's time to just move on to that next agenda item. Of course, they also need to help facilitate discussions and decision making. One big part of it is to make sure that as leader, they are engaging a wide variety of voices around the table, not just the loudest ones. When I was leading this webinar earlier just now, I had a lot of pauses. I was waiting for you guys to type something in the chat box, trying to get you guys to be more engaged. And so that's partly the role of the leader. Sometimes you need just to sit there and let the group come up with some answers. And of course, it's the job of the leader to delegate when necessary. Finally, my last slide before we get to 11:30 is, okay, that's fine for the leader. What about the group? And this goes back to what we were talking about with Megan earlier. Before the meeting, it really is not too much to ask. It's standard practice to have the group read their board packet in advance and be prepared to participate, so that time at the meeting is spent making decisions and having discussions and not just reading and asking questions about things that was already, sent out to the group. Of course, during the meeting, they need to participate, stay on topic, speak concisely, take responsibility, and basically, I love this one, assist the group in achieving its purpose. Any other thoughts about the responsibilities of either the leader or the group members that I haven't covered that you guys would like to share with the rest of the group? Yeah, Marilyn's saying, and honestly, it's going to take planning. One thing I've learned in leading a lot of meetings and in talking with folks that do lead a lot of meetings, it is most of the work is up front, and it does take that time in advance. I try to get my packet out a week in advance. I know trying to throw the agenda together right before the meeting. I know that's how we end up with a lot of our busy lives. It's hard to get kind of in that habit of, okay, I'm going to try and get an agenda out a week in advance so that people have that and they're looking at it. And you're right. It just takes planning and being intent with it. So with that, you guys, I wish you good luck in leading more effective meetings and working with your groups. Hopefully, some of the things I've talked about can help you steer them in towards a culture of more effective meetings by getting a lot of this stuff done up front. Is there anything that anybody else would like to share or any question you have before we end here? Any last thoughts?